My name is Paul Wagner. I come from a long lineage of people involved in telecom and infrastructure and software developers, a bunch of nerds in my family. I've got roughly about 15 years of experience working in infrastructure sales and sales engineering. I even do sometimes get my hands dirty. This was a storage array that was upgraded. There was a company called 3PAR that was purchased by HP. They made some of the they have all kinds of different storage tiers in these types of arrays. Anyway, this consulting company that I worked with for Bloomberg ended up upgrading their 3PAR array. So I've done and actually this type of migration, we actually migrated the data in the East Coast of the United States between these two racks, or the newer racks, and then we actually shipped the rack to Texas because that was the fastest way to actually move. Back then, this was almost 8 years ago, a petabyte of data, it was faster to put it on a truck than move it over 10 gig circuits. So that actually still holds, and in fact, it holds even more now that there's more data on the planet. A little bit of just street cred. I worked for the original creator of the NFS file systems on Microsystems, somewhat as they were coming down, but they at one point controlled about 80% of the world's global internet traffic. And that tech is still in use, and Oracle still sells nearly all of their products under their name. And then I am based in Texas most of the time, or at least when I'm not here in the APAC region. I'm going to just do a quick hand raise. Are there any existing storage providers in the room? Two. Where are they based? Sydney? Oh, Andrew. You're with Andrew Lease. It's Nathaniel. Got it. Okay. Where is the SP? Used to be in New York? Just curious, how much were you paying per rack in New York? Was it in Weehawken or was it in Manhattan proper? Upstate. How much were you paying per rack? 2,000. Even in the Northeast still. Interesting. I know rack space prices pretty well around the US, so good. Any new storage providers in the room? Okay, that's probably over there. And those with enterprise sales backgrounds or enterprise sales engineering, pre-sales, anything like that? Okay, good. And then software developers. Okay. Professional dancers. Got it. Okay, we got a few. Perfect, great. Just trying to understand where the crowd is if I need to shape this a little bit. I think I have somewhat limited time, so Jenks, I'll keep going. But I will try and keep it interactive. And then just new entrants to the Filecoin ecosystem. Anyone here know nothing about Filecoin? Man from Korea in front who we've already met. And also you know nothing about Filecoin, or? Okay. Just these sessions. This is your first time learning about Filecoin. Okay, good. Okay, great. Please stop me in the middle of this as well, because I have a lot of forward-facing knowledge about what's been going on in trying to develop out the products and services that are being built on top of the Filecoin network. And I also have opinions about where I think it should go. I'm not necessarily right about that. But if I were to say you were going to double down with your money, some of my ideas would be worth maybe exploring or talking about. This is a chart some of you have already seen. I like to highlight this. I think it's important to understand that not all technology gets built overnight. We take a lot of it for granted, especially when it comes to storage. Storage, for a lot of people, is probably very boring. But if you've ever interacted with it at the bit level or the byte level or the NFS level or built out a JBOD, you understand that it actually takes a lot of work to get it up and running, and that then there is maintenance across that life cycle of the array. But you can kind of see here we've gone through a journey. We come somewhere in the early 2000s when the major cloud providers start launching. And in the early days of the cloud providers, they were buying major brands of hardware, which was actually very cost prohibitive for them. They're probably on like their generation 3. They're using white label equipment, much like a lot of the Filecoin storage providers are at the massive scale that some of them are at. But they probably still are buying Seagate disks or Hitachi. So there are the guts of the cloud providers, at least from the plumbing perspective, is still AMD, Seagate, and the likes of that. But it highlights here, at least when I look at AWS, GCP, Azure, and I really do need to add in the Chinese providers in here, that industry is actually very young, maybe 10 years old at best. And if you look at where Filecoin's at, we came in around 2020, the implementation of IPFS further back than that. But we still have a long way to go, and then over time I would see this graph maybe moving up and down, or preferably up and to the right. I think everyone prefers up and to the right graphs, unless you're in a totally different game. But this is just very important to highlight that over time, many things change, but they take longer than you think. And as fast as we can move, we're still limited by years, in my opinion, on how things will evolve. The reason I put this up, I think some of you will probably know this quote. I actually cannot say it in Chinese because I don't have the translation in front of me, is that there's some preparatory work that we all need to be working on now because there could be a storm and there also could be competitors. I like to highlight that at times there is no one stopping forking Filecoin or starting a new project. I think some of our Web3 competitors are here. There's also nothing stopping AWS, GCP, Azure, or the likes to actually evolve their storage products to have some of the feature sets that I believe we have a competitive advantage over. So now is a great time to, in my opinion, start digging and build for the future. Otherwise, this is one of my favorite quotes. If anyone here has ever seen, who here has seen the trilogy Infernal Affairs? The Hong Kong trilogy? Does anyone remember how it ends? It doesn't end well. Everybody dies. The point here, this quote is, he who lives in continuous hell never dies. We need to be very, very forthright about where we're at in our ecosystem, because we need to start building, and we need to start building faster. There is a massive opportunity. The global storage market is about $200 billion that we know of. That really probably does not include all of the tape storage that we cannot account for because that's dominated by a few players. We fit into the blue box for now. That doesn't mean that the infrastructure that's in place, the protocol standards that are in place, and the technologies in place cannot expand into the larger market. But we all do know that we're sitting in an archive storage market right now, and we need to focus on that at least for the foreseeable future to take a large percentage of that pie. Why is archive storage interesting? For me, when I look at storage, if you look at the traditional commits, at least in many parts of the world, I know in Asia that people tend to vendor shop every year and they won't sign multi-year commits. But from the storage front, when you're signing an archive deal, often the first discussion is 3 or 5 years. I understand that's much different in APAC. People do not want to sign 36-month commits. But in the United States, the archive storage market is a nice, healthy business. It's like picking a long-term partner. It pays dividends. It may not be as exciting as chasing AI, but there's still a margin there. Like any technology product, we are fighting against price, hands down. There's no other way to get around that. I know that there are some people out there thinking that we cannot charge for storage. Yet, I don't think that's the case. I think the tooling is going to come very quickly, and we need to ensure that we've come to the table with regional pricing that might be built by a consortium. The Filecoin Foundation and Protocol Labs will not advise on that pricing. We will happily ensure that there is some agreement on pricing so people are not gouging. But it is an open market. You can charge whatever you want. I like to highlight these major cloud providers here. Red is egress. Egress destroys, well, it actually gets a lot of people fired when they don't pay attention, because then the CTO pulls them aside and says, why did you let this bill run out of control? Then they call their Huawei cloud person. Raise your hand, Huawei cloud. They're up here in the second row. and they say, why did you not sign a commit or a top-end number? Do it now or you're fired. Just some regional pricing that I was pretty surprised at. I do this in every country. These are spot prices. They're not negotiated prices, but spot prices can usually tell you what your discount will be across the top. You can see at least from the premium product that's being offered, AWS. AWS in Singapore that I know of, I'm going to be very careful saying this, but most of it is paid for by the Singapore taxpayer, meaning we know who the largest customer is. For the Alibaba Cloud side, I don't know what your market share is, but I suspect it's probably between somewhere in the teens, just given what I know about the market here. But you are offering a cheaper price. We're offering a likely even more cheaper price. These are based in dollars. I do believe in Singapore that price would probably be between 5 and 10, depending on the level of service. But egress kills. It also kills jobs. It also just causes a lot of problems. In our market right now, I tend to say that we are competing against Backblaze and Wasabi, and they are offering an all-you-can-eat menu option with some level of agreement. If you upload a petabyte of data, they will allow you to egress that entire petabyte of data each month once. If you go over that, they'll turn you off or they'll call you and try and get more money out of you. But they are winning business on the basic backup and object storage because they make it simple for customers. And people are less likely to get fired because of the red burgeoning egress problems. We also talk to a lot of customers. Specifically, this is very important in every market. I don't know any country that, if you're dealing with a government or even academic institution, is dying to let their data be moved outside the four walls of their environment. I know that there's some problems we are facing with Phil Plus that is forcing people to replicate data, and there's not enough storage providers in the country. I stand by the fact that that should go away. It causes a lot of problems, and then we actually don't. I think it's perfectly okay to have 3 copies or even just 1 copy with an unsealed copy in the region, because most customers are not going to pay for the additional copy. I would say, in my experience, outside of major corporations having a hot and cold data center or an active data center where they have a disaster recovery budget, most people are only going to have the money for 1 copy. I know we've tried to force this, and it's been a good experiment. I do believe there'll be an evolution where the requirement will be 2 copies in a region. It does not have to be replicated outside the region. Also, I fully understand that there's a language barrier when you're trying to replicate data to tier 1 providers on the network between the US, China, etc., and there's also a time zone difference. So unless that is required by the customer, I foresee it changing to where, from both the audit perspective and the ease of forced replication, that it stays within the 4 walls of the country or the region. Any questions on that? I know everybody here that's probably done a deal, a Phil Plus deal, or at least tried to replicate data, has been in a number of different chat channels that were 12 hours latent trying to get the deal flowing. And I think it's just really inefficient. So it needs to, in a lot of respects, go away. Okay, this is where we win. That doesn't mean the cloud providers cannot win against us, but we have a competitive advantage right now. We have features they do not offer. And in some respects, we're offering it at a marginal cost that's less than what they could if they were to spin up the team and build it. There are a lot of overlapping features. I tend to, at least in my experience, if I'm the outbound person or I'm engaging with somebody at a conference, content-based addressing is important, but the major cloud providers can hand back a hash and you can index that. So unless you have a lot of time to be able to explain that to someone, the number one thing I'm able to at least get the discussion started, especially if they've lost data in a major cloud provider, is that we have an incentive-driven network. And yes, it can be very expensive to pledge data onto the Filecoin network. We all know that. I think on a Phil Plus deal today, on a terabyte, it would cost you 60 Phil, so $200 or $180. So do the math on that. It's a lot per month. If you do it on a non-Phil Plus deal, I think the pledge in the collateral is accurate to a large-scale deal, and the penalty is accurate to what would happen if you were not providing 5 nines. Most of the providers on the network, if you look at the slashing rates, are certainly meeting the 5.9 criteria, if not more. So we are competitive, at least on the SLA side as well. The other option that comes up, at least from why are you better, is we are able to move data between providers seamlessly. That is much harder to do between cloud providers without getting hit with egress fees, and or it's just hard because the tooling is much harder. I like to look at Filecoin as a massive block storage network, which allows you to move those 32 gig files, 64 gig or smaller files if you've chosen that, between providers easily. I think everyone is probably aware of these features and how they're beneficial, but how to present them to the customer, all these slides and more I have and are available if you want to use them to outbound with customers or work with ISVs. But what I want to get into next, opportunities. Direct client onboarding from a client to an SP, very difficult. I don't actually see that being the most successful path. I think there will be opportunities there, but in general, everyone in this room interacts with AWS, Alibaba, Tencent, GCP, Azure on a daily basis, but they do it through an application. Unless you're, turning up your S3 API key. But that's how interactions need to occur on the Filecoin network in order for it to be utilized at scale. There's a term we like to use. It's called ISVs, independent software vendors. But before you even start that, I want to talk about some opportunities where there are periphery markets in this ecosystem that are underserved. And there are some things missing that we have not had time to do. And that is specifically bottom-up TAM analysis. What is the service addressable market in Bangladesh? It could be 0. I have no idea. But there are opportunities there to look at the map and go, is anyone doing anything here? Because trying to compete in tier 1 markets like Singapore and China can be very difficult. I also don't think we necessarily have the product to compete in those markets all the time, but the periphery markets where there is an addressable market are open. And I'm going to talk about one that I've seen recently. I've called them the IPS, India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Why I think they're important, we see a lot of requests from them. They do not traditionally have the capital. Well, that's not true about India and Indonesia. They may not have the risk profile, but they have a large developer community. The developers are marginally cheaper, at least by 30–40% than even Thailand. They have a large interest in the cryptocurrency industry and the blockchain industry, but they are lacking capital to build storage providers in those markets. And they do not need 50 PIB. In fact, they probably would be fine with a 5 PIB setup. But I look at those markets and say there's opportunity for partnership, and there's also an opportunity to steal the cloud customers away from those markets because they're actually very expensive, at least from a regional currency perspective. And I see a large opportunity there to still be in the price point that I talked about, near $5 a TIB or more. The next one, which in order for this network to be successful, it's going to have to be front-end interfaces that probably don't even talk about Filecoin. And there are a number of those that we've tried and failed. It is taking time to get there, but there will be more, and there are plenty more out there. Some of them need to be built. Some of them just need to be integrated. This is a lot of my focus. If you are working on this, please talk to me about this. I can tell you where we're seeing success, where we're not seeing success, also where there needs to be a doubling down, in my opinion. Okay, great, perfect. And the focus on that really tends to be, outside of having the Alibaba or the Huawei Cloud people in the room, is that there are a lot of second tier providers that do not have the CapEx to build out an archive storage tier. And they're around. There's a couple in Southeast Asia that we have engaged. What we would need is a storage provider that would be able to integrate with them. There's definitely a closed tooling gap. Some of that is being resolved right now through a group of tools at Protocol Labs, but some of those tools also will need to be built by you. They can also be built by people in these periphery markets because they understand how to do it, and they're far more focused on software, in my opinion. I know Robert is here somewhere. He can talk more about India, what he's been seeing in India. So maybe put that twice, skip that slide. This one here, does anyone want to translate this for me here? I'm seeing some of the Chinese look at it, but it basically is like, we need to be more aggressive, hands down. You'll see people like me at some of these conferences being very aggressive in trying to push, because now we're at a point where we have a massive piece of architecture and footprint across the world, and now is the time to push on these ISVs and say, we have a better offering. But in order to do that, the approach is regional. But when it comes to the offering on the pricing, I tend to say it's better to approach this from a wholesale storage standpoint. We can wholesale them storage. If needed, we can relocate equipment to their data centers as well. But in order to win these markets and win these ISV opportunities, we have to jump into the fire and get out there. I know that there's some people in the room doing that. There's also some people in the room wondering how to do it. Talk to me about how to do it. There's large amounts of opportunity, at least to kick the door down, start the conversation, and ask if people are ready to have this as an option. And some of them are not. Some of them are willing to have the discussion, and it takes up to a year or more to get it going. There's a couple of different ways to get a hold of me. WeChat is no problem. I respond to that relatively quickly. And then here is all the other opportunities from Telegram, LinkedIn. My phone number is no longer on there. I was getting a bunch of spam calls asking for money. But I gave them Jank's wallet address, and it's fine. How about some questions? Please ask me questions. I have been on probably north of 200 engagement calls in the last year, so I can tell you, what's working and what's not working, what the pitch should look like. Maybe there is no pitch. Maybe we need a demo. Oh, I can't. Okay, I'll let Porter go first because he's going to be the elephant in the room. I've said this before, and I know I'm beating a dead horse on this. This is an English term, sorry, or beating a dead elephant in this region, or dead white tiger. Sorry, that was an endangered animal. But we need a UI. The UI doesn't necessarily have to be amazing. We've had some UIs, but it needs to probably obfuscate nearly everything from Filecoin until the customer asks what the back end is. And that UI needs to do one thing fairly easily. It needs to have an access control list. It doesn't need fancy SAML authentication, but it does need to be able to roll an API key that they can then download the standard S3 tools or something very similar and upload a large piece of data, and then it needs to make that deal. We almost had this with Estuary, but it was missing some gaps there. The reason that's important is that I think there's a couple storage providers in the room that'll tell me this, but without that, demoing Lotus commands, even in person, even to the most technical of people, is a death spiral, and we usually don't get the second call. perfect. Data center prices are about half of Hong Kong. I've seen 1,300 a rack in KL in a tier 3 data center. I don't know what the ISV market looks like. I'm happy to add it to my list. We have an ongoing Southeast Asia growing list, but that goes back to what I talk about. Before you even look at what you think is a market, it's probably best to do a standard bottom. You can do a top-down analysis, that's easy, but I would do a bottom-up analysis of whether or not you can generate $500,000 in revenue or $1 million, and what does it take to get there, right? Are you selling at $5 a terabyte? Are you selling at 10? Do you have to have multiple products to get there? I'm always cautious when people say there's a big market opportunity without telling me that, okay, even if there's 100 PIB in Malaysia, but maybe the entire archive storage market in Malaysia is only 50 PIB and it's already full. So, and how many people are in Thailand are going to store data in Malaysia or Singapore in Malaysia? Probably more Singapore to Malaysia, but that's where I've seen some gaps in the thinking of that there is a market, because the cold archive tier may just be already filled up and it's non-existent because they don't have that kind of market. India actually has a lot of tape arrays in deployment because they were very cheap, and Hitachi and Storage Tech and Oracle were able to deploy those over the years, and they're relatively stable. But the retrieval is terrible on tape. One of the problems in India is the circuit capacity. The internet is expensive and slow. It's slow in the sense that on a 1 gig, you're paying about $3,000 to $5,000 US, which is expensive. If I was going to focus on an ISV in Malaysia, I would try and get the most information about whether or not they feel their customers are all in Malaysia. I mean, there are plenty of ways around this, right? I would say, though, from an archive tier, because you're doing a long-term commitment and that data is likely sensitive, they're probably going to want it in the 4 walls of Malaysia, which actually might bring an opportunity that I don't know about, wherein AWS does not have an endpoint in Malaysia. And are Malaysians open to storing data in AWS Singapore or Huawei Singapore? Maybe not. So that's where I bring up the periphery markets, because we actually have the ability to deploy relatively lightweight infrastructure on a per rack basis with software that is mostly ready to go in markets that AWS is not willing to touch. And there could be I look at some of these businesses as $500,000 a year to, we'll call it 5 million if you can, get to that level. But they're not $50 million markets. They're not. But I would much rather be running a very easy to run $2 million ARR business with an OpEx of 1.5, taking home 500 net with a few staff and just pocketing that on long-term deals in Malaysia versus trying to fight anyone and everyone in Singapore or Shenzhen for preeminent data storage. It just, to me, seems like a very difficult market to compete in. In North America, it's a little different. Danny.
So if you're talking about sort of competing with Wasabi and those kind of services, does the fact that you need to keep a sealed copy and then like a hot copy, does that affect the math of that, or is that something that just blends into the
I wish we had more SPs in here. There's a group of SPs that say doesn't impact our COGS, right? But I can tell you on a let's just do quick math on what it normally costs on a CapEx to lay down a petabyte of data. It's about 50 cents spread across 5 years, at least on the cost structure. But you're right, now you've got to store 2 copies. But if Huawei Cloud wants to give away their cards, I know for sure that AWS in a region stores 2 copies of your data, but they only charge you for 1. And the reason they do that is because and this is true of Dropbox as well, they have a concern that when they rack data, 20 racks this way, that it's very possible all those racks could lose power at once, right? So they will be rack aware, and they will say, I have one copy in row A, and then I have another copy in row D. So major cloud providers are storing 2 copies as well. The benefit is that they hide it from the customer. But I think unfortunately that's going to be part of the cost of goods sold until further notice. And some SPs can handle it. Some SPs tell me that this is the death spiral. I don't have a solution outside of, look, you need to be able to provide retrievals. And in order to provide retrievals, the requirement is store an unsealed copy until further notice. But great question, because it comes up all the time, because it 2x your storage costs, for sure. Thankfully, the margin here, and who is here? Most of the SPs are somewhere between $2 and $250 per month, spread across an amortization of 5 years on equipment. $1 of that is CapEx, $1 of that is OpEx, and then a buffer in there. So if you can wholesale that storage for $5 or even close to $350, it's actually a very good product margin, right? That's in between 30 and 40%. It's not quite retail Keystone 100% product margin, but from a tech perspective, it's very good. Anyone here that's ever, Jenks, you could probably speak to this, pushed boxes, as we like to say in the industry, most of the tech industry is resellers on major cloud providers are making 2%. So from a product margin, it's a good position. From an ISV perspective, I cannot tell you right now if it's good to be an ISV buying wholesale storage from, because if they're able to sell at 6 Wasabi prices and buy at 3, that's great. That gives them a good buffer. I think we need to be in that markup range of at least 30 to 60%, and we are right now. So that's healthy. If we got rid of the unsealed copy, I think, and we could unseal the copy relatively quickly, I'm pretty sure a lot of the SPs might store a sealed copy because the retrieval is always going to be faster. You just don't have to do the GPU processing. And we're seeing, I think people are probably seeing with the retrieval bot now, who's actually doing the unsealed copy storing, and the success of that is actually quite high if you're actually storing an unsealed copy and running a 10 gigabit circuit, and you actually have your file system configured correctly, and maybe you're running SAS for SATA disks. A few things go into the mix of that. But when it comes to at least the competition of, what I think is what they're providing on these products, we're on par. And actually, I would love to add Dropbox in here, because Dropbox runs their entire 3 data centers in the United States on SATA drives. Very, very cheap hardware. A lot of the SPs, if you were to talk to them, are running SAS, or they're at least running, and they're not cheap. These are Huawei grade JBODs. Very expensive equipment, very high-end equipment. So we actually can win on that if somebody actually really cares, but nobody really cares. But if you walked into one of these data centers, it would all look like no-name brand equipment, and just inside of it is a Seagate drive. Now they've optimized it, but again, they're not storage companies first. They're software companies first. So they have problems for sure. They've just optimized 90% of all the data on Dropbox gets actually moved to a cold tier, because after 30 days, it's 90% of it's not retrieved. They know that for sure. Any more questions? Time out. Thank you.